The sun had barely begun to rise over Jeffersonville, Indiana, on the morning of September 11, 2014. Locust Street was quiet, lined with modest houses, most of them still dark as their occupants lingered in the last moments of sleep. The stillness of that early morning held no hint of what waited inside one of those homes, no warning that the day would bring a scene so horrifying that even seasoned law enforcement officers would struggle to erase it from their minds. At 9 a.m., a call came into the Jeffersonville Police Department. Tammy Jo Blanton's co-workers were concerned. She hadn't shown up for work, and she wasn't answering her phone. It wasn't like her. She was punctual, dependable, the kind of person who would call ahead if she were running even a few minutes late. Concern quickly turned into action. Officers were dispatched for a welfare check, expecting they might find her ill or asleep, perhaps simply unable to get to the phone. When the patrol car pulled up to the single-story home on Locust Street, nothing about the scene suggested danger. The yard was neat, the house quiet. But as one officer stepped onto the porch, the first sign of trouble revealed itself. The front door frame bore fresh damage. Splintered wood curled away from the lock, and the door sat uneven on its hinges. It was a small thing, but it was enough to send a ripple of tension through the responding officers. They knocked. Their voices echoed into the stillness of the house. "Jeffersonville Police Department." No one answered. One officer tried the knob. It turned easily, the door swinging inward with a low creak. Inside, the house was dim. Curtains drawn tightly blocked the morning light, and the air felt heavy and unmoving. A metallic scent hit the officers almost immediately, faint at first but undeniable. Years of experience told them this was no ordinary call. Moving carefully through the narrow hallway, their boots clicked against the hardwood floor. One officer reached the bathroom at the end of the hall. The door was nearly closed. The scene inside was a snapshot of brutality. Tammy Jo Blanton lay in the bathtub, her body submerged in water that had long gone still. The pale tone of her skin contrasted starkly with the crimson that swirled faintly in the water around her. Wounds covered her chest and torso, deep, deliberate strikes. More than 20 in total, though the officers would not learn the exact number until later. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, the smallest, almost involuntary sound broke the silence. The sharp inhale of an officer who had seen too many crime scenes and knew instantly that this one was different. It wasn't just the violence. It was the absence. Pieces of her were missing. The officer nearest to the door turned away. His hand pressed against the frame as if steadying himself. Another raised his radio, voice clipped and tight. "Dispatch, we have a homicide. Requesting detectives and crime scene unit." Within minutes, the quiet neighborhood was transformed. Patrol cars lined the street. Yellow tape stretched across the yard, cordoning off the home as neighbors emerged onto porches, their conversations hushed. A few whispered Tammy Jo's name, confusion and dread mixed up in their voices. Inside, detectives arrived and immediately took a look around the scene. The bathroom became the center of their focus, every movement deliberate, every surface carefully documented. They counted the wounds, noted the angle and depth of each one. When the search extended to the kitchen, the case shifted from shock to something darker. On the stove sat pots and pans, some with residue that had no place in any meal. There was evidence of cooking, boiling, frying, paired with traces of human tissue. The quiet murmurs among the investigators gave way to a grim certainty. This was not only a murder. It was something far more disturbing. The name Tammy Jo Blanton was passed along the chain of command. Detectives began to piece together a timeline. Her co-workers had called in after her absence. The door showed forced entry. The officers who responded the night before remembered escorting away a man she said was trying to break in. His name, Joseph Oberhansley. Meanwhile outside, the sun climbed higher, casting light across the yellow tape that fluttered in the morning breeze. For the first time that day, the weight of the crime began to settle over the scene like a shroud. When Tammy Jo's body was finally removed from the house, officers stood back, some looking away, others staring at the ground. Even in their line of work, there are scenes that stay with you, that carve themselves into your memory. This was one of those scenes. Back at the station, the question on everyone's mind was the same. Who could do something like this? And if it was Joseph Oberhansley, what could drive a person beyond murder into such an act of desecration? But as the day went on, one thought became unavoidable. Whatever happened inside that small bathroom in the early hours of September 11th was more than an act of violence. It was a glimpse into a darkness that few would ever be able to fully comprehend. On the night of September 10, 2014, the air over Jeffersonville carried the cool bite of early autumn. Locust Street was quiet, its row of modest homes lit by the soft glow of porch lights. Inside one of those houses, Tammy Jo Blanton moved through her rooms with a tension that wasn't part of her usual routine. Something had shifted. In the days leading up to that night, friends had noticed a change in her. She spoke less of Joseph Oberhansley with the easy tone of a relationship in bloom and more with the careful words of someone treading on uncertain ground. Whatever had once drawn them together had begun to crumble, replaced by arguments and a growing sense of unease. Shortly after, that unease became fear. A pounding at her door jolted her awake. The sound was sharp, urgent, followed by a voice she knew too well. Joseph. His words were muffled, but the tone carried a weight that set every nerve in her body on edge. Tammy grabbed her phone and dialed 911. The recording of that call would later become a haunting artifact of her final hours. Her voice was calm, but beneath it ran a current of urgency that spoke louder than words. She told the dispatcher that Joseph was outside, trying to force his way in. She needed help. Minutes later, the red and blue lights of a patrol car washed over her front yard. The pounding stopped. When the officers stepped onto her porch, Joseph was there, standing close to the door as if the barrier between them was nothing more than an inconvenience. The officers separated them, speaking to Tammy through the partially opened door. Her relief was visible even in that brief exchange. She explained the situation. He wasn't supposed to be there. She wanted him gone. The officers' words were firm but measured. They told him to leave, to stay away from the property. He complied without resistance, his face unreadable. They watched him walk down the street before turning back to Tammy. She nodded, thanked them, and closed the door. For a moment, the house felt safe again. She locked the door, checked the windows, and moved through the rooms as if reinforcing a protective barrier. But fear, once it crosses a threshold, is not so easily turned away. In those hours after the officers left, the house must have felt different. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of settling would have sounded amplified. She might have sat in her living room with the lights on, waiting for the sun to rise, waiting for the feeling to pass. Tammy had done everything right. She secured her home. But in the stillness of that early morning, before the first streaks of dawn, a choice was made outside her control. Somewhere in the darkness, Joseph Oberhansley circled back. His steps would not echo until hours later in a courtroom, but on that night, they carried him back to Locust Street, back to the door he had been turned away from. At what point Tammy realized he had returned, no one can say. There are no recordings of the moment the door frame splintered under pressure, no witness to the second the lock gave way. But somewhere between the pounding on the wood and the breaking of it, she would have understood that the thin line of safety she had tried to draw had been crossed. When the sun rose on September 11th, it rose on a house that no longer held the quiet strength of Tammy Jo Blanton. Her final hours had been a fight not just against a man, but against the inevitability of violence she couldn't have imagined days before. For the officers who had stood on her porch that night, the realization of what followed would cut deep. They had heard her voice, seen the fear in her eyes, and walked away believing they had restored her safety. In reality, those moments were the prelude to something no one could have stopped once it began. Before her name became a headline, Tammy Jo Blanton was simply Tammy to those who knew her best. She was a daughter, a friend, a woman whose life unfolded in the quiet, steady rhythm of ordinary days. Born and raised in Indiana, Tammy had grown up surrounded by family who cherished her for her warmth and loyalty. She carried those qualities into adulthood, becoming the kind of person others leaned on in moments of trouble and joy alike. To her friends, she wasn't just dependable. She was a source of light, someone who knew when to listen and when to fill silence with laughter. At 46, Tammy Jo had built a life defined not by grand gestures but by the small things that give life meaning. She loved mornings with a cup of coffee in hand, sitting on her porch as the sun climbed over the horizon. She found joy in music, in cooking for the people she loved, in conversations that stretched late into the evening and left everyone smiling. Her co-workers described her as a pillar in the workplace, the type of person who would pick up a shift without complaint, who arrived early and stayed late when needed. Reliability wasn't a trait she put on, it was woven into her character. That's why, on the morning of September 11th, when she failed to answer her phone or walk through the office door, alarm bells rang immediately. Tammy's life was not untouched by hardship. Like many, she had weathered storms, relationships that didn't work, struggles that tested her resilience. But each challenge seemed to sharpen her determination to live on her own terms. Those closest to her believed she was entering a new chapter, one where she was reclaiming her independence and her peace. Her relationship with Joseph Oberhansley had once seemed like a fresh start, a chance at companionship. But over time, cracks appeared. Arguments replaced laughter. Her friends sensed her uneasiness growing. Tammy never dramatized her problems, but there were small shifts in her tone when his name came up, the way she avoided certain topics. In the weeks before her death, she was trying to pull away. That decision would become the silent backdrop to the events of that September night. It wasn't just about ending a relationship, it was about preserving her safety and her sense of self. When Tammy called 911 in the early hours of September 11th, it wasn't just a plea for help, it was an affirmation of her will to live. She wanted him gone. She wanted her space back. She wanted the normal rhythm of her life to continue. Mornings on the porch, laughter with friends, days defined by the simple and beautiful things she had always cherished. For her friends and family, the shock wasn't just in the brutality of her death but in the absence of her life. The phone calls that would never be answered. The seat at the table that would stay empty. The warmth of her presence, gone in an instant of violence. Tammy Jo Blanton was a life in motion, cut short before its natural arc. And to tell her story is to remember her not only for how she died, but for how she lived. When detectives first heard the name Joseph Oberhansley, it wasn't just another entry in a police report. His record carried the weight of violence long before Tammy Jo Blanton's name became tied to his. In 1998, Joseph was 17 years old, living in Utah, when a single day defined the rest of his life. He had been in a volatile relationship with a young woman, one that, by all accounts, was already fraying. In a burst of anger, He confronted her over a claim that the child she carried wasn't his. The confrontation escalated into a tragedy that left her dead, his mother gravely wounded, and Joseph himself clinging to life from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He survived. His mother survived. But the young woman did not. For that crime, he was convicted of manslaughter and attempted homicide. The sentence kept him behind bars for over a decade. Those years were supposed to be the line between the boy who killed and the man who would emerge, reformed. But time doesn't always heal what's broken inside. When Joseph walked out of prison on parole, he was a man with a history hidden beneath the surface. To those who met him casually, he could seem composed, even polite. He held jobs. He moved through life as if the past were locked away with the court files. When he met Tammy Jo, it was another chapter, one that might have been written differently if not for the shadow trailing behind him. Joseph carried with him not just a criminal past, but something deeper, something that those who studied his case would later describe as a fracture in the way he saw the world. He had been treated for a traumatic brain injury after his 1998 suicide attempt. Combined with a violent history and underlying psychological issues, it painted a picture of a man standing on unsteady ground. To the officers who escorted him away that night, he was calm, almost too calm. His compliance wasn't the relief they might have hoped for. It was the stillness of someone who had already made a decision. What drove him back to Locust Street in the early hours of September 11th will never be fully known. Was it rage? Possession? A compulsion buried so deep that no intervention could have stopped it? Whatever the answer, when that doorframe splintered and the lock gave way, Joseph Oberhansley stepped into Tammy Jo Blanton's home carrying not just a knife, but the echo of a crime he had committed 16 years before. History might have repeated itself. The forced entry would later tell the first part of the story. The doorframe splintered, the lock broken clean away. It was a violent threshold, the last barrier between Tammy and the man she had tried to keep out. What happened next, no one living can say with certainty. There were no cameras in that house, no witnesses to create a fracture of what really happened in that moment. The story is told through blood spatter, the angle of wounds, and the silent testimony of a room turned into a battleground. The attack was swift, brutal, and personal. More than 20 stab wounds marked Tammy's body, each one deliberate. The strikes were concentrated on her chest and torso, as if driven by a rage that had narrowed into something surgical. The bathroom became the center of the violence, the small space amplifying every movement, every struggle. At some point, the violence shifted. The line between killing and desecration was crossed. When investigators later processed the scene, they would note the absence of pieces that should have been there. Tammy's heart, parts of her lungs, and tissue from her brain, gone. The kitchen told the rest of the story. Pots and pans on the stove, traces of cooking, evidence that what had been taken from her body had not been discarded. In later interviews, Joseph would offer a confession in fragments. He spoke of eating part of her heart, of consuming pieces of her as if the act itself held meaning beyond the killing. Whether it was delusion, ritual, or simply the farthest reach of depravity, no one could say for certain. When the attack was over, the house fell silent again. A silence so deep it would last until the officers returned hours later to find what he had left behind. In every crime scene, there is a point where violence ends and absence begins. In Tammy Jo Blanton's bathroom, that point came too soon, and it carried the weight of a life taken with a brutality that even seasoned investigators would struggle to understand. As detectives reconstructed the timeline, the night unfolded in chilling clarity. Tammy's call to 911, the officer's intervention, Joseph's removal from the house, the return in the early hours, the forced entry, and finally the attack. When they found Joseph Oberhansley later that day, his calm demeanor was a jarring contrast to the horror inside Tammy's home. Blood evidence tied him directly to the scene. In interviews, his story shifted. First denial, then claims of unknown intruders, and finally, in moments that would later haunt the courtroom, an admission that only the killer could give. He spoke of eating part of her heart. For the forensic team, the evidence was more than just data points. It was the physical weight of what had happened in that small house. Each bagged item, each photograph surface carried the imprint of violence so personal that left veteran investigators shaken. When the last piece of evidence was logged and the scene was cleared, the house stood empty. But the weight of what had happened there lingered in the walls, in the splintered doorframe, in the silence that settled back over Locust Street. For Tammy Jo Blanton's family, the arrest of Joseph Oberhansley brought a brief glimmer of relief. He was in custody. He would face trial. There would be answers, and there would be justice. Or so they thought. In the years following the murder, the case became tangled in a slow-moving legal process. Joseph's mental state was questioned almost immediately. Psychologists evaluated him, debating whether he was competent to stand trial. His defense attorneys painted a picture of a man broken by a traumatic brain injury, someone incapable of fully understanding his actions. For Tammy's loved ones, each delay was another wound. The courtroom remained empty, the trial date pushed further and further away. They were forced to relive the details of her death not in the catharsis of a verdict, but in the endless waiting. When the first trial finally began in 2019, it felt like the first real step toward closure. Prosecutors laid out the evidence: the forced entry, the blood, the forensic proof tying Joseph to the crime. The defense countered with claims of delusion and mental illness, arguing that this was not the act of a sane man. And then, in a single moment, it unraveled. A witness mentioned Joseph's past crime, the 1998 killing in Utah, in front of the jury. It was information the judge had explicitly ruled inadmissible, fearing it would unfairly bias the jury. The defense seized the moment, filing a motion for mistrial. The gavel fell and the trial was over. For Tammy's family, it was a blow that cut as deep as the crime itself. They had sat through days of testimony, listened to the worst details of her final moments, only to see it all collapse in an instant. Joseph was returned to jail. The case reset. Another trial would be scheduled, another jury seated. But the delay stretched into months, then years, as new competency hearings began. In Jeffersonville, the community felt the weight of the delay as well. Locust Street remained a quiet reminder of what had happened, the house Tammy had once called home now a landmark of tragedy. Each time her name appeared in the news, it was attached not to her life but to the question of whether the man accused of taking it would ever face justice. Justice delayed is not just a legal term. For families like Tammy's, it is a daily reality. The mistrial didn't erase the evidence. It didn't change what happened inside that bathroom. But it reminded everyone watching that the road to justice is not always straight. Sometimes it twists, stalls, and forces those seeking closure to wait in the shadow of the past. After the mistrial in 2019, the courtroom emptied, but the case didn't fade. Instead, it shifted into a different kind of battle, not over evidence, but over the mind of the man accused. Joseph Oberhansley sat in a cell as experts began dissecting the question that would hang over the proceedings for months. Was he sane? Did he understand what he had done on September 11, 2014? Or was the horror inside Tammy Jo Blanton's home the product of a mind lost in delusion? Competency hearings began with clinical precision. Psychologists studied his history, tracing the line back to 1998 when he had shot himself in the head after killing his girlfriend in Utah. That injury left him with a traumatic brain injury, the effects of which were still debated. Some experts argued that damage to his frontal lobe had impaired his impulse control, leaving him vulnerable to violent outbursts. Others pointed to patterns in his behavior that suggested calculation, not chaos. For Tammy's family, the hearings were another layer of anguish. They sat through testimony about brain scans, neurological damage, and psychiatric evaluations, listening as their loved one's death was filtered through clinical debates. Joseph himself added to the weight of the hearings. In court, he shifted between calm and erratic. At times, he spoke clearly, offering statements that showed awareness of the charges against him. At others, he rambled, claiming conspiracies, hinting at delusions. His words were a window into a mind that seemed to straddle the line between reality and something else. One psychologist testified that Joseph had been diagnosed with multiple mental health conditions, including psychosis. Another countered that his actions on the night of the murder, forcing entry, moving Tammy's body, attempting to destroy evidence, showed a level of planning inconsistent with total mental collapse. The hearings stretched on. Each report, each testimony added another layer to the question. Could this man stand trial and be held accountable under the law? In late 2019, a decision came down. Joseph Oberhansley was deemed incompetent to stand trial. He was transferred to a state psychiatric facility for treatment, the goal being to restore him to competency. Months passed, and treatment began slowly. Reports later came in suggesting that Joseph's mental state was stabilizing. The goal was not to heal him completely, that was beyond the scope of the law, but to ensure he could understand the charges and participate in his defense. In 2020, after years of waiting, a judge ruled that Joseph Oberhansley was competent to stand trial. The courtroom would open again. The evidence would be heard again. And the question of sanity, though never fully answered, would now give way to the question of guilt. For the jury that would eventually sit in judgment, the hearings became part of the larger picture. A man with a violent past, a traumatic brain injury, and a crime so brutal it defied comprehension. For Tammy's family, it was the closing of one chapter and the opening of another, as they braced themselves to hear the details of her final moments all over again. By the time Joseph Oberhansley's second trial began in August 2020, 6 years had passed since the morning officers stepped into Tammy Jo Blanton's bathroom. It had been 6 years of waiting, hearings, and evaluations of mistrials and mental health debates. 6 years where her family carried the weight of unanswered justice. The courtroom in Clark County, Indiana, was subdued when the jury filed in. This was not a sensational spectacle. It was a quiet reckoning. At the center of it sat Joseph Oberhansley, older now than when he'd been arrested, his expression unreadable as testimony began. Prosecutors opened with the evidence everyone in the room had come to know: the broken doorframe, the blood, the forensic trail that led from Tammy's bathroom to her kitchen. Photographs were shown with clinical detachment, though nothing could soften their impact. Witnesses testified about the night before, the 911 call, the officers who escorted Joseph away, the quiet that followed before the violence returned. Crime scene technicians walked the jury through their findings, explaining the patterns of blood, the missing tissue, the evidence of cooking that turned a brutal murder into something even more chilling. But the jury heard more than clinical diagnoses. They heard Tammy's 911 call, her voice calm but edged with fear as she asked for help. They saw the photographs of the locks she had checked, the doors she had tried to secure. They listened as prosecutors connected the dots between a violent past and a violent present. After days of testimony, the case went to deliberation. Hours stretched long in the courthouse as Tammy's family sat in silence, waiting for the words they had been chasing for 6 years. When the jury returned, the room held its breath. The foreperson stood, voice steady as the verdict was read. He was found guilty. Guilty of murder, burglary, and abuse of a corpse. There was no death penalty on the table. Instead, the sentence handed down was life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Joseph Oberhansley, there would be no more doors to splinter, no more nights outside someone's home. For Tammy Jo Blanton's family, there would be no true closure, but there was at last an answer. In the moments after the verdict, the courtroom remained quiet. Justice in cases like this doesn't bring applause. It brings a heavy exhale, the kind that comes when a long, unbearable chapter finally ends. Outside, the news spread quickly to Locust Street, Jeffersonville, and beyond. 6 years after a bathroom became a crime scene, a jury had finally spoken. On Locust Street, the house where Tammy once laughed, cooked, and shared quiet mornings was no longer a home. For some in Jeffersonville, it was a scar. For others, it was a place to pause and remember. Neighbors spoke of her in the present tense for as long as they could, as if refusing to let the brutality of that September morning erase who she had been in life. Her co-workers kept her memory alive in small ways. A framed photograph, a story told over lunch, a laugh remembered when the workday grew long. For those who knew her, Tammy Jo was not a victim first. She was a person, a woman who loved simple joys, who carried kindness in her everyday actions, who deserved a life far longer than the one she was given. The case left ripples that stretched far beyond Jeffersonville. It reignited conversations about domestic violence, about the systems meant to protect people when relationships turn dangerous. Advocates used Tammy's story as a rallying cry, a reminder that calls for help must be met with vigilance because sometimes the danger doesn't end so softly. For Joseph Oberhansley, life without parole meant decades of walls and routine, a cage for a man whose name would forever be linked to horror. His story became a cautionary tale in criminal psychology classrooms and law enforcement briefings, a study in how past violence can echo into the future when warning signs go unheeded. In the end, what remains of any story like this is not the crime itself but the humanity that existed before it. Tammy's life was not defined by Joseph Oberhansley. It was defined by the love, the warmth, and the evergreen memories she had left in the minds and hearts of the people she encountered before her life was sadly cut short. What remains is a reminder, a call to see the people behind the headlines, to remember that every crime scene begins as someone's home, someone's life, and for Tammy Jo Blanton, that reminder is both heartbreaking and enduring, that even in the shadow of unimaginable violence, the memory of a life lived fully can outlast the horror of its ending. And with that, we have come to the end of today's episode. If you like and support what we do on this channel, feel free to drop a like, it helps our channel grow. Also don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notifications for future follow-ups with our channel. We truly appreciate our audience, and we are poised at delivering chilling and mind-boggling videos like this every week. Stay well and stay safe.